Now, the title of this sermon is Joseph in the Land of Goshen. And if you've watched movies, the cartoon version was Joseph, King of Dreams. There was one, the multicolored coat, Joseph in the psychedelic. Anyway, there's all sorts of different names of Joseph, and it's his story, Joseph and his brothers. And why would I pick Joseph in the Land of Goshen? Well, here's the reason. If Joseph hadn't put his brothers in the land of Goshen, then the Bible would have ended at chapter 51 or so. And that would have been the end of the story. There would be no more story. But later on, I'll explain that to you as we go along, and you'll see why it was so important that they lived in the land of Goshen. But we have to start quickly, and I'm going to start right away and tell you the story of Joseph. It's a wonderful story. And the first part of it is the dream. He had some dreams, and they were the straws that broke the camel's back. In 37, if you go back 10 chapters, in Genesis 37, we hear of Joseph. It said in verse 5, then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And in verse 9 it says, and now he had still another dream, and related to his brothers, and said, lo, I've had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon, the 11 stars were bowing down to me. And he related it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this? Shall I, your mother and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the sayings in his mind. Now, there's a couple things I want to look at this is, they disliked him, and that dislike was turning quickly to hatred. And when his father rebuked him, there was a couple reasons. One was that he said, yeah, I know, it says in verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons. And so you add on top of this, Joseph keeps having these dreams. And he said, shh, don't say that, you're going to make them hate you worse. So that's one of the reasons he rebuked them. But here's the thing I thought of, is that Joseph was a prophet. And this was the prophecies of God. These dreams were prophesying that God was saying, I'm going to do something exceptional with you, Joseph, and I want everyone to know before it happens that it's me doing it. I'm going to do it, so I'm going to give you a dream so that you know what's going to happen. And you think, well, why would Joseph tell these dreams? Well, if you've ever been with a group of kids, you're a young person, and you're drinking milk, and somebody tells a joke, and you start to laugh, and you don't want to spit it out, and then it comes out your nose. Well, Joseph had to tell these dreams. A prophet had to do what God told him to do. He had to tell the dreams. And so, you know what happened. His brothers hated him, and he was his father's favorite. And, you know, it might have been justified that his father, who was old, chose him as his favorite. In verse 13 it says, Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Shechem. Sorry, I lost that for a minute. Shechem, come and I will send you to them. And he said, I will go. He didn't say, they don't like me. I don't want to go visit them. Send the servant. He didn't say any of those things. He just said, I will go. And it's a really nice thing when your child says, yes, I'll do it. Because it's all a lot easier when your child says, no, I'm not doing that. And then you have to discipline them. And if you look at one of his other brothers, well, his other brother in 34, just turn back a page, 34 verse 20, it says, 35, verse 22, sorry. Came about when Israel was dwelling in that land that Reuben went and laid with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. So you want to compare the two. His oldest son sleeps with his wife, and his youngest son says, yes, I'll do it. Now, I'm going to tell you quickly a story of my father. When we were growing up, I don't remember my father ever having a favorite. But as we got older, as Dad was in his 70s and he was losing his eyesight, he stopped driving. So I always drove him to church. He always came to church with me, and if he wanted to do stuff, I didn't tell him no. He was in his 80s in the woods cutting wood with a power saw, and he couldn't see. I didn't say no. He said, yeah, no, let him make his own choices. And he appreciated that. And so I was his favorite. And no matter what was done, I always get double credit for anything I did. And my brother and sister got half credit. This past winter, my sister went to see him, and it was a snowstorm. And she got out in the snowstorm to see him. And the first thing my father said is, I need you to call Peter and tell him not to come to visit me because it's not safe. He might get hurt. And that's one of many stories where my father has picked me as his favorite in his old age. Well, let's move on. We know what happened. He went, and he arrived, and he's on his way. In chapter 37, 21 and 22, or 19 and 20, he said, here comes that dreamer. Now, then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say a wild beast devoured him. Let us see then what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard this and rescued them out of their hands and said, let's not take his life. Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into the pit that's in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father. Now Reuben understood that he made his name a black name in his father's eyes because he slept with his wife. And he wanted to fix this. And the way to fix it was save Joseph. But what I call this a missed opportunity, because see, he saved his life, but while he was out doing other things, they sold him into slavery. And he came back and he tore his robes and he said, what am I going to do now? You see, what he should have done was said, Joseph, get behind me, and you guys, you're going to have to come through me to get to Joseph. I'm taking him back to his father. We're not doing him any harm. That's what he should have done. But he missed that opportunity. You see, he should have done the direct approach. Well, we met Ishmael last week. Ishmael was Abraham's son, his first son. And God said, I'll make Ishmael a great nation too. So we get to meet Ishmael's children. Well, the people were coming over the rise, and Joseph was in the pit, and they said, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. That's Ishmael is his great uncle. These were his cousins. So if you think your own family's bad, think about this. Poor Joseph, his brothers are going to kill him, and they're selling him to his cousins into slavery. Not their best moments. Well, the next point is Joseph's prison ministry. You know that he's sold to Potiphar. In chapter 39, verse 5 and 6, it says, it came about that time, they made him overseer of his house and over all that he owned. And the Lord blessed the Egyptians' home when they counted Joseph. And the Lord blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and the field. So Joseph was blessed by Jesus, and Potiphar reaped those benefits. Potiphar understood that there was something special about Joseph, and so he was really happy to have this slave who worked hard, who was a good manager, who was making him rich. And you know the rest of the story. It's the next verses. It says, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. He was a really nice-looking guy, and he had all of those things that made you think, that's a really good-looking man. And the wife of Potiphar was after him continually. And eventually it came to the point where Potiphar's wife had him alone in the house and said, come sleep with me, and he wouldn't. And you've heard that expression, no fury like a woman scorned. And she was extremely angry with him, and she was going to have him destroyed. If you turn to 19 and 20 of that chapter, it says, now when the master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what the slave did to me, his anger burned. Now I want you to think about this, it doesn't say his anger burned against Joseph. I have this great movie at home. It's called Joseph. It's 4 hours long, and it's an exceptionally well-done story of Joseph. And in that movie, there's a picture of Joseph and Potiphar, and Potiphar is extremely angry, and they're having this talk, and he's mad at Joseph for allowing this to happen because you're my best guy, and I'm going to have to do something because that's the way things are. I got to save face. And he said to him, I didn't touch your wife. And he said, well, how do I know that? He said, have I ever lied to you in the whole time I've been with you? And so Potiphar understood that if it wasn't Joseph, there was only one other person it could be. It had to be his wife. And now Joseph gets thrown into prison. It says here, now Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. And you think to yourself, oh, man, where's this prison? Well, let's go back to the first of the chapter. Chapter 39, the second part of that verse. It says, Potiphar, the Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard. Now, that's the captain, he's the captain of the bodyguard. And go to 40, and it talks about the two officials, the chief cupbearer. In verse 3 it says, so he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, the same place where Joseph was in prison. So think about this. Joseph is put in prison. Where's the prison? In the house that he's lived in all this time. Just another part of the house. And I thought to myself, I wonder who's being punished here. Is it Joseph or Potiphar's wife? Potiphar's wife wants him destroyed, but now he's still in the same house. He's in the prison, in the house, and she gets to see him and recognize that there's nothing going to happen to him that she wants, and besides, he's still handsome. And he's still good looking, and he's still unattainable. And then it goes on to, well, he's in prison. And if you read on, it talks about in verse 22 of 39:22, the chief jailer committed to Joseph charge of all the prisoners that were in jail, so that whatever was done, he was responsible for. You see, the chief jailer lived in the house, in another part of the house, in the same house that Joseph had been in. He knew Joseph was an exceptional manager. And so as soon as he said, Joseph's in my prison, I'm going to take advantage of this. What a great stroke of luck for me. I can have Joseph manage the prison. And so Joseph kept busy and he kept sharp for these years that he was in prison. And then we meet the baker and the cupbearer. And they both had a dream. And God gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. If you turn to verse 8 of 40, it said, then they said to him, we both had a dream, and there's no one to interpret it. And Joseph said to him, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell it to me, please. So the two dreams were one that pointed out that the cupbearer was going to live and the baker was going to die. And Joseph said to the cupbearer, you're going to go and serve Pharaoh. Remember me to him, because I shouldn't be in jail. I've done nothing wrong. And of course, the cupbearer is exceptionally grateful to know that he's not going to die and not going to spend the rest of his life in jail. And so he feels bad, but he forgets. And now something really good is going to happen. Now, if you remember, I said he was 17. Now he's 28. It's 11 years later, and the baker and the cupbearer leave the prison. He's been 11 years as a slave. And so 2 years more pass. In chapter 41, verse 1, it says, and it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And the Nile dream was that there was 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows, and the 7 thin cows ate the fat cows. And then he had another dream about corn that showed the same thing. And he's really upset because these dreams mean something. He knows they mean something, and he has to get an interpretation, and he calls all the wise men and says, what does this mean? Well, they didn't know. And now, it says in verse 9, then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh and said, I would make mention today of my own offenses. The cupbearer realized, oh, I forgot. I was supposed to rescue Joseph, and now God has planned this. This is God stepping in and saying, okay, the timing is perfect now for Pharaoh, because if he'd heard it 2 years ago, the cupbearer who's just come out of prison, he's going to tell this story, and he tells it to Pharaoh, and he says, Joseph's in the prison, and he knows how to, and Pharaoh goes, oh, this was really interesting. Can I have some more wine? And the cupbearer feels better because he's done his bit, but now the cupbearer is telling it at the exact perfect time. There's no better time. Pharaoh needs someone to interpret dreams. I know of somebody to interpret dreams. I should have told you and I forgot. In verse 14, it says, Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his clothes and came to Pharaoh. And he told all the dream. He interpreted the dream, and he explained to Pharaoh, now you've got to get somebody really wise, because you're going to have 7 years of incredible bounty, and then 7 years of famine. And if you haven't prepared for it in the 7 years of plenty, you're all going to starve to death. So, in verse 41:38-41, it says, then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the divine spirit? Well, Pharaoh's servants are being very quiet because they're going to say, that's me. Don't promote him, that's me. But he kept on going and said, Pharaoh said to Joseph, since the God has informed you of all this, and there's no one so discerning and as wise as you, you shall be over my house, and according to your command, all the people shall do homage. And he made him the chief of all of Egypt. And the timeline is now 30 years. He's 30 years old. It's 13 years since he became a slave, and now he's the head of all of Egypt. And as a gift, he gets a wife. And then, over the next 7 years of plenty, he has 2 children. And so everything is going exceptionally well for him. And there's a bunch of naysayers, too. You don't hear about this, but there is. Because if you remember the story of Daniel, you remember what Daniel in the lion's den? How did Daniel get in the lion's den? people were conspiring against him. And so I can't imagine that no one conspired against Joseph. And so at the end of the 7 years, everyone's just saying, oh, well, this is just going to continue. And then you have 2 years of, in 53 of that 41, it says, when the 7 years of plenty, which had been in the land of Egypt, came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. Because in the first year, everybody had enough stockpile, but then it comes to the second year, when the famine was spread over all the face of the earth. Oh no, sorry, it's verse 56. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, go to Joseph. So now it's 39 years. He's 39 years old, and all of this has come to pass, exactly what is said. Well, number 5 is the wheels are in motion. In verse 40, chapter 42, 1-3, Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. Now we're back to Jacob. 39, 17, 22 years ago, Joseph is lost to Jacob. And now we meet Jacob again. Jacob is saying, there's grain in Egypt, get down there and get some. And he sent his sons. But he wouldn't send Benjamin because he was afraid to lose Benjamin just like he lost Joseph. And so off they went. And in verse 8 of that chapter it says, and Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they didn't recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them. And he said to them, you are spies. You've come to look at the undefended parts of the land. And this is the story, is that he had a choice at that point. He could have ran out and hugged his brothers and said, it's me, Joseph. You sold me into slavery, but remember those dreams? And you see, it would have been the same as all those people who bowed and scraped before Joseph, but in the back of their mind they want to make sure he fails, just like they did for Daniel. He wanted to make sure his brothers repented. See, here's what has to happen for it's like when my children came to me with a splinter in their hand. And Dad, there's a splinter right there. Can you get that splinter out? And I said, yes, I can. And I took this little pocket knife out of my pocket, this one right here, and I opened this up, and I spit on it, and then I wiped it on my pants to sterilize it. And then I went like this into their hand, and they pulled their hand away. But see, I had to do that so I could take this little part out, its tweezers, and then I could pull the splinter out. But they didn't like me sticking the knife into their hand. And you know why? Because it hurt. But in order to get the splinter out, you have to get at the end of the splinter. Joseph was getting at the end of the splinter with his brothers. If he hadn't said to them all these things, and he made them go back and get Benjamin, he brought Benjamin to him, and then they took the cup, and then he said, whoever stole my cup is going to be my slave. And then his brothers said, don't take him. We have to send Benjamin back home to his father because... And Judah said, I'll be your slave. Take me, I'm stronger. He recognized that at that time, his brothers had repented. And he didn't want to do this. This hurt him more than it hurt them because they didn't understand. And they went home and they were gone for months and months and months, and he had to wait. And it says that in 24, he turned away. In 22 it says, Reuben answered them and said, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." And they did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them, and he turned away from them and wept. He recognized, just like I recognized, that I didn't want to stick my pocket knife blade into my children's hand, but I knew that they had to get the splinter out. Because the splinter, if you don't, it gets festered and it gets infected. And so this is what he did. You see, a lot of people come to Christianity and they say, I'm successful, I've got a bunch of boxes I want to tick in my life. I have children, I got that box ticked. I got a good job, I ticked that box. What about religion? And they say, well, Christianity is a real nice religion. People are nice, they have potluck suppers, they sing nice songs, and that's really, and all those good things, and I'll add that box, I'll tick that box. And they come to Christianity and they're fine. But they still have the splinter. They still have the sin. Joseph recognized that his brothers had to get rid of the splinter. And you see, Jesus comes to us and said, Jesus said, "Come to me, you are heavy laden, I'll give you rest." He wants to save us, but we have to recognize that we have sin in our lives. Well, the last point I want to make is, remember I told you about Goshen, in the land of Goshen, and it was important? Well, if you turn to chapter 45, verse 10, this is making a nation. "You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, your flocks, your herds, and all you have." Now, if you continue on, and we'll read this in chapter 47, we read already, where Joseph brought his brothers, and Pharaoh said, "You take whatever the land you want. Egypt is open to you." So there's two choices for Joseph. He could bring all his brothers down, and he could settle them in the main city where he lived, and he could give them a ton of money, and they could be happy and wealthy and live a life of retirement. That was one option. And if they did that, everyone would say, I want to be Joseph. I want to be related to Joseph. Let me marry your granddaughter, and we'll be related, and I can get good stuff from you. And you see, they would intermarry. Well, they would have to stop being shepherds, because the Egyptians hated shepherds. And so Joseph understood that if his brothers and family was going to be in Egypt, he had to put them in another part of Egypt, which was Goshen. And so they ended up in the land of Goshen, which was a great place to have flocks and herds. In 47 verse 5, in verse 6, it says, "The land of Goshen and Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your fathers and brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. If you know any capable men, put them in charge of my livestock." You see, if they lived over there, they were the hated shepherds, and no one would want to join them. And they stayed the tribe of Israel, the nation of Israel. And as the time passed, and people forgot about Joseph, and they forgot about all the good he'd done, and they recognized that these people were becoming a huge nation, let's make them slaves. Who would want to intermarry with slaves? And so, over the 400 years that they were there, they became a nation of 2 million people who were completely separate nation. God, in his mercy, stepped in from the upper story into the lower story and said, I'm going to make a nation to send back to the promised land that I have promised them. They haven't intermarried with anyone else. There's no one who else wants to be an Israelite. And I have made it so that the story doesn't end in chapter 47. We get all the rest of this story because of the land of Goshen. Joseph made sure that his family continued and the nation continued, and because he was God's prophet, he wanted to make sure that all of this happened so that we have another parts of the story. You see, God sometimes has to make our life what we don't want. We look at it and say, why would this happen to me? But God has a good reason. The Israelites were saying, why are we slaves? Well, God had a good reason for that. It was a temporary thing. It was pulling back the skin to get at the end of the splinter. It was all of these things God in the story is providing for us so that when something happens to us and we don't understand it, we can say, that's awful, it's hard, but God understands our story. And He is going to bring this to the right at the end. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for the story of Joseph.